In the heart of New York City, under the neon lights that never sleep, a powerful CEO walked into a failing diner disguised as an ordinary customer. What he found wasn't just bad service. It was fear, corruption, and a single mother trapped in a dangerous game she never asked to play. Her daughter's life became the bargaining chip, and every shift turned into survival. But when one desperate note slid across a table, everything changed, sparking a fight against a man so ruthless, he'd rather burn an empire than be exposed. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below, and let's begin this story together. The neon in Times Square makes promises it can't keep. Under the billboards and the noise and the bright, hungry light, a corner diner wore the same cheap smile, a chrome grin dulled by fingerprints, a bell over the door that didn't bother to ring anymore. Jonathan Cole stood across the street in a thrift store jacket and a Yankees cap that was 2 sizes too large, letting the evening crowd carry him forward like a current. He could still see the numbers without looking at the report again. Revenue down 18%, complaints up 32%, turnover a brutal 67%. Ratios like that didn't just happen. They were engineered or permitted, and either way, the fault rolled uphill to his name. Coleman Hospitality Group was his to answer for. The Times Square Diner, one of their flagship high-visibility locations, had become a rumor even among tourists, the kind of place you went when everything else had a line. He pushed the door open and stepped into a wave of stale coffee, fryer oil, and something sweet gone a day too long. The bell stayed silent. A hostess stand sat unmanned. Someone had balanced a stack of menus on the edge like a dare. The laminated covers were fogged with fingerprints. A busser swiped at a table with circular motions that never quite found the crumbs. Jonathan took a seat in a corner booth by the window, the cracked vinyl sighing under his weight. He slid the menu toward himself and felt the sticky seam along the fold. A ketchup bottle bled around its cap. The sugar caddy was all blue packets, none of the regular ones anyone wanted. Small details, loud messages. The ceiling lights buzzed as if they were thinking of quitting. A cook barked something from the pass and a plate rattled. 2 servers moved like people trying not to be seen, eyes low, shoulders tucked. Fear had a posture, and it was everywhere in here. Jonathan lifted his eyes and clocked the camera dome above the register. Dark. Either broken or broken. At the far end of the counter, an assistant manager in a maroon tie counted cash with a hand shielding the bills, then slipped the stack into a slip pocket before disappearing through a swinging door that said staff only. A waitress approached with a coffee pot. Her shoes had been taped at the toe where the sole wanted to peel. A thin silver bracelet flashed when she reached to pour. No name tag. She kept her eyes on the cup as she filled it, the steam curling up like something trying to leave. "Coffee's fresh," she said, voice even. "You want water too?" "Please." She nodded and was already moving before he could add a thank you. The mug was clean, at least. He took a sip and felt the burn ride the back of his throat, bitter and medicinal. On the wall by the restrooms, a framed health inspection grade from months ago hung with a tilt. A handwritten sign beneath it read, "Cash preferred" in block letters. Preferred by whom was the question. He let the room talk to him. A delivery guy in a hoodie wheeled in a dolly stacked with boxes labeled specialty meats, no brand, just black marker. No one checked the count. The maroon tie assistant manager reappeared to sign the slip and didn't bother comparing it to anything. Out on the floor, a pair of tourists waved their hands in the air for a check and got ignored. A table of 3 at the window had waited long enough for ice cream that their Sundays were going to be soup. A cook jabbed a finger at a server's ticket, and the server flinched like he'd been nearly struck. Service wasn't just falling apart. It had learned to live in pieces. Jonathan drew a breath that tasted like fryer oil and patience. He wasn't here to posture or lecture. A CEO at a boardroom table could talk policy and brand standards until everyone's eyes glazed. But a man at a sticky booth with a lukewarm coffee could learn where the rot began. He glanced at the check rail. Too many voids. A red pen line through an entree that never made it to the kitchen. Stubs with no server numbers. The language of loss, fluent and bold. He took out his phone like any other bored customer and thumbed open his notes app. The list he started wasn't dramatic. Bell non-functional, camera dome offline, voids on rail, cash handling off floor, delivery unchecked, morale visible. He added the kind of details auditors laughed at until they didn't. Ketchup crust, warped tabletop, frayed apron strings. The place had stopped believing it mattered. People didn't care about what didn't care about them back. A man in a blazer who wore authority like a coat too small swept in from the sidewalk, pulled a server aside and hissed into her ear. She nodded without hearing. Jonathan caught only the tail end, a word like targets, then a sharp, "Do your job." The man's eyes flicked across the room, landed on the dead camera dome, and slid off again. He didn't order food. 2 teenagers at the counter peeled apart a grilled cheese and laughed without sound. At a 4-top, a mom cut pancakes for a child who wasn't interested. The waitress with the taped shoes reappeared with water and set it down carefully, aligning the glass with the ring the coffee had made, as if neatness could undo what disorder had decided. She glanced at the door, the clock, the manager. A beat too long. Something lived under her quiet, a held breath quality, and then it was gone. Swallowed the way people swallow in places like this. Jonathan ate a plate of eggs because he had to order something, and because eating let him stay. The yolks skittered around like they were avoiding a conversation. He kept his eyes soft and curious, the way he'd learned to in negotiations where power was a costume and attention was a currency. He studied the drawer pulls on the register, polished from years of use, and the way the assistant manager touched them like they were a habit. He watched the staff move in lanes that never crossed, hospitality trained to avoid collision, but also to avoid each other. The door opened, and a gust shoved in a cold slice of city, sirens somewhere, a bus braking, the metallic smell of rain that hadn't started yet. The lights flickered and steadied. On the counter, the tip jar had a scratch across its glass like a scar. Someone had inked a smiley on a post-it and stuck it to the jar, its mouth starting to curl at the corner. Hope, or the performance of it. He remembered the board packet from last week, the bullet points, the CFO's practiced calm, the line about temporary variance that had made the word temporary feel like a prayer. He thought about the people this place paid, poorly, he suspected, and the people it served, indifferently, he knew, and the gap between intention and effect. He thought about his father, who had taught him to check the back door of a kitchen before he judged the food. The back door here probably didn't close right. When the check came, it was handwritten on a pad that had lost its carbon. Cash preferred, the sign had said. He put down a 20 and waited without looking like he was waiting. The assistant manager returned with change that didn't add up until it did, when a single slid into his palm as if by mistake. Jonathan let it sit there and didn't look at it. Outside again, Times Square tried to dazzle him back into forgetting. He stood with the cap brim throwing a narrow shade over his eyes and watched another delivery arrive. This one through the side alley, free of logos and free of hurry. He saw the waitress, the taped shoes, the silver bracelet, step outside for a breath of air she didn't have time to take. She looked up at the sky like it owed her something, and then down at her phone like it owed her more. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know which of the faces in there had learned to be scared, which had learned to scare. He only knew the numbers were true, and the feeling matched them. The diner's smile was a mask, and masks always tell on themselves. Tomorrow he'd come back in a different jacket, at a different hour, and he'd sit somewhere the camera should have seen him and listen to the way fear rearranged a room. For tonight, he wrote 3 more words in his notes before the light changed and the crowd pushed him along. Stay in plain sight. The city swallowed him, and the diner kept smiling with its broken bell. Rachel Adams had learned to move fast, not because she loved the rush of restaurant life, but because survival demanded it. At 28, with Lily waiting at home in a rented apartment 2 subway stops away, every shift was another equation of exhaustion against necessity. The shoes on her feet weren't just taped, they'd been retaped twice that week. Between the diner, an overnight cashier job at a pharmacy, and a weekend bookkeeping gig for a laundromat owner, her calendar looked like a puzzle missing sleep as its centerpiece. What most of her coworkers never guessed was that Rachel had once dreamed of being an accountant in a downtown office with clean blinds and a desk she didn't have to share. She still carried a binder of old notes from community college, corners softened by years in her bag. Numbers spoke to her in a way people rarely did. They made sense, They told truths if you knew how to listen. Which was why, when she volunteered to review the diner's invoices one quiet afternoon, she noticed immediately that the math was lying. It wasn't the obvious kind of mistake. The columns added up too neatly. The totals matched the receipts exactly. But the suppliers listed were shadows, companies she couldn't verify, invoices written in a language of round figures and signatures that repeated like a rubber stamp. At first she thought it was sloppiness. Then she looked closer. The same meat delivery charged twice on separate days. Cleaning supplies billed in amounts that could stock a hotel, not a corner diner. And always signed off by one man, Victor Kane. Victor carried authority like brass knuckles wrapped in a handshake. He was the regional manager, the one who showed up in expensive suits that looked borrowed from someone colder, and the staff knew his visits meant trouble. Rachel tried to keep her head down, but numbers left evidence, and she couldn't unsee it. That night, she sat at her kitchen table after Lily had fallen asleep beside a half-colored picture of a giraffe. Bills fanned out in front of her, along with the photocopies she'd made of the invoices. Her hands trembled over the papers. She thought about tuition loans, about the landlord's notice slipped under the door, about Lily's asthma inhaler waiting to be refilled. If she stayed silent, maybe she could keep her fragile world upright. If she spoke, she risked everything. The choice found her first. 2 days later, in the back hallway near the supply closet, Victor blocked her path. His cologne was sharp enough to sting. He didn't shout. He leaned in close, eyes flat. "Smart girl like you should know when to stop reading," he murmured. "Numbers can get dangerous, especially when they start talking outside this building." She swallowed. He tapped the wall above her shoulder, casual and terrifying. "You've got a little one, don't you? Cute kid. Walks home from school with those colored pencils sticking out of her backpack." His smile cut thin. Wouldn't want her to get lost in a city this big. The hallway seemed to tilt. Rachel nodded once, said nothing, and pushed past him with her tray of menus. But the words lodged inside her like splinters, each one reminding her that fear wasn't abstract anymore. It had Lily's name on it. That night, she barely slept. She kept the photocopies hidden in a cookie tin above the fridge, listening to the rhythm of Lily's breathing, as if the child's small lungs were her only compass. In the morning, she walked into her shift with a smile painted on her face, just like the others. Except now, every step carried the weight of the secret. It was during one of those shifts that she noticed the man in the Yankees cap again, the quiet one who didn't fumble his change, who watched the room as if the walls were whispering to him. Something about him didn't match the rest of the diner's clientele. When she dropped his check, she slid a folded napkin beneath it, her handwriting sharp in rushed pencil. Careful. They're stealing. He's dangerous. Please don't say my name. Her heart thudded so hard she thought the sound might give her away. She turned before he could speak, carrying a tray of empty glasses, pretending to be just another waitress in taped shoes and a tired smile. Behind her, Jonathan Cole unfolded the napkin. His eyes lifted, not with surprise but with recognition, as if the truth she'd risked everything to share was the missing piece he'd been waiting for. Jonathan Cole waited until the late shift thinned the diner into a half-empty echo. The neon outside flickered against the windows, washing the booths in restless color. Rachel moved between tables with the same weary rhythm, but now he could see the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her eyes checked the corners of the room before she set down a plate. The napkin note still burned in his pocket. When she finally slipped into the break room for a 5-minute pause, he followed, careful to look like another customer stepping out to use the restroom. The door swung shut behind them with a thud, muffling the sounds of dishes and conversation. She spun at the sound of his footsteps, breath catching. For a second, he saw the steel beneath her exhaustion. "You shouldn't be back here," she whispered, words edged with suspicion. "I read your note," Jonathan said quietly. "You were right to warn me." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't believe in allies anymore. The diner had wrung that faith out of her long ago. "You think you know what's happening here? You don't." Jonathan didn't argue. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad, pages lined with his neat handwriting. Observations, dates, discrepancies. He held it where she could see without taking it from his hand. "I've been watching. The deliveries that don't add up, the voided checks, Kane's little cash slip games. I know enough to say you're not imagining this." Rachel stared, torn between fear and relief. Her instinct screamed to stay silent. Her heart begged for someone to share the weight. "If you're right, then why are you here?" He hesitated, telling her the truth, that he was the CEO, the man ultimately responsible for the rot she'd uncovered, could ruin everything if she didn't trust him. But lying wasn't an option either. He chose the narrow path in between. "Because this place matters to me," he said simply, "and because you matter. You're risking yourself, your daughter, just by writing those words. That doesn't go unnoticed." The mention of Lily shifted something in her face. She hugged her arms across her chest, as though to shield the child from the shadows pressing in. "Victor knows about her. He made sure I understood what that means." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he softened his tone. "You don't have to fight him alone. I can help, but I need you to believe I'm not here to hurt you." Silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of the soda machine. Rachel searched his expression for cracks, signs of manipulation, hunger, or indifference. What she found instead was steady resolve, the kind she had once trusted in her father before life grew complicated. Finally, she exhaled. "If I give you proof, real proof, and you get caught, you'll end up destroyed. Victor plays dirty." "Then we'll play smarter," Jonathan said. It wasn't bravado. His calm certainty steadied her enough to imagine a different outcome, one where Cain wasn't untouchable, where Lily could walk home without eyes watching her from shadows. Against her better judgment, Rachel nodded. "I have copies of invoices, hidden. If you want them, you'll have to earn them." Jonathan offered a faint smile. "Fair enough. I'll keep coming here as a guest. Nothing changes on the surface. But when you're ready, pass me what you can." The fragile thread between them held. Not strong enough to trust completely, not yet, but strong enough to tie two unlikely people together. A waitress fighting for her child, and a man she barely knew who carried secrets of his own. Rachel glanced at the clock and pushed past him, her apron brushing against his sleeve. "Go sit down before someone sees," she murmured. "And whatever you do, don't draw attention." Jonathan returned to his booth, the napkin note now joined by a second vow etched silently between them. The battle ahead promised fear, risk, and betrayal. But for the first time since stepping into this broken diner, he no longer felt alone. By the end of that week, Jonathan Cole had seen enough to understand Rachel's warning was no exaggeration. The diner was more than a failing business. It was a front, its ordinary chaos masking something far darker. Every night he returned, wearing different jackets and caps, pretending to be a nameless face in the crowd. Every night, the shadows showed him more. The deliveries bothered him most. Trucks without logos appeared after dark, their back doors swinging open to reveal crates marked with vague stencils, supplies, special goods. Never a brand he recognized. No invoices were checked in public. Instead, Victor Cain or one of his cronies would escort the driver through the alley, exchange papers, and vanish inside. When Jonathan pressed his coffee cup to his lips, he could see money folded into envelopes, tucked casually into back pockets. Staff lived under a constant current of threat. He noticed how waitresses kept their voices low when Victor walked through the door, how line cooks stiffened when his men lingered by the pass window. One busboy had a bruise on his jaw that no one mentioned. Another employee quit mid-shift, stripping off his apron and muttering, "Not worth my life," before disappearing into the street. Rachel tried to mask her fear, but Jonathan saw it in the way her eyes darted to every entrance. One night, she approached his booth with a coffee pot and slipped a folded ledger sheet under his napkin. Her hands trembled only once before she pulled away. Later, in the privacy of his apartment, he studied the page. Inflated charges, duplicate suppliers, signatures looping across multiple dates. Fraud so blatant it had to be deliberate. The next day, Jonathan tested the cameras. He stood beneath the dome near the register, staring directly into it. No red light blinked. No angle followed him. The entire system had been gutted, wires clipped, the black lenses serving only as decoration, to lull outsiders into thinking surveillance existed. Then came the texts. Rachel showed him one night behind the diner, her phone screen glowing in the dark. "Nice kid. Cute backpack. Careful crossing Broadway." Another read, "Smart moms keep quiet. Dumb ones don't stay moms long." Her breath shook as she held it out to him, but her voice was steady. They're watching Lily. Jonathan's fists clenched, rage burning beneath his practiced calm. "We'll protect her," he said, though the words felt too small for the danger pressing closer. That same week, Victor staged a performance. He gathered the staff in the dining area after closing, a speech dripping with menace disguised as motivation. "Numbers are improving," he announced, waving a sheaf of papers Rachel recognized as doctored. "But any leaks, any whispers to the wrong ears, and you'll wish you never worked here." His gaze lingered on Rachel until she looked away. Jonathan sat in the corner, a customer finishing his late meal. Victor's eyes flicked toward him briefly, then dismissed him as irrelevant. That dismissal was the only advantage Jonathan had left. The network wasn't just mismanaging funds. It was organized, deliberate, ruthless, smuggling disguised as supply shipments, contracts steered to shell companies, employees intimidated into silence. And Victor Kane stood at the center, his smile as polished as the cufflinks glinting in the diner's failing light. For Rachel, every shift became a balancing act. Serve customers, protect Lily, and quietly funnel scraps of evidence into Jonathan's waiting hands. For Jonathan, the disguise grew heavier. He wasn't just a CEO playing detective anymore. He was a man entangled in something that reached further than he'd ever imagined, something that could swallow them both if one step faltered. And in the shadows of Times Square, the walls of the diner seemed to lean closer, listening. The first evidence Jonathan and Rachel gathered looked strong enough to topple a tower. Copies of invoices, falsified ledgers, and one shaky audio recording Rachel managed to capture on her phone when Victor hissed threats in the supply hall. Jonathan studied the files late into the night, each page confirming the corruption he'd suspected, each detail a nail in Kane's coffin. For the first time, the weight of the fight seemed to tilt in their favor. But victories in places like this never came unchallenged. 2 days later, Jonathan arrived at the diner in his usual disguise only to feel the air shift. Staff kept their heads down, but not in the normal rhythm of fear. This was heavier, more suffocating. Rachel slid a plate onto his table with trembling hands. Beneath it, a note. "They know. Be careful." That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from his corporate office. Words cut like razors. Federal investigation. Misuse of funds. Financial misconduct. The allegations weren't just rumors. Documents had been submitted under his name. False transfers. Accounts linked to his signature. It was a carefully crafted snare, and he was the one caught inside it. News outlets seized the story within hours. Headlines painted him as the reckless CEO siphoning money from his own company. The board issued a statement, taking the matter seriously. The media vultures circled, feeding on every rumor. Overnight, Jonathan's reputation, a lifetime of work, began to crumble. Victor Kane had played his hand. Jonathan returned to the diner, careful not to reveal the storm outside. Rachel met him in the alley during her break, her face pale. "They want me to sign something," she whispered. From her apron, she produced a document with legal headers and company seals. Her name sat at the bottom line, a space waiting for her to accuse Jonathan Cole of orchestrating the fraud. Her voice cracked but did not falter. "If I refuse, he'll go after Lily. If I sign, I destroy you." Jonathan looked at her, seeing not just a waitress but a mother balancing on the edge of ruin. He laid a steady hand over the paper. "Don't sign," he said firmly. "We'll find another way." "But, no." His tone left no room. "Kane forged those documents against me. If you sign, he wins both battles. Hold on. Trust me. Behind the calm, Jonathan's mind raced. He had already made a call earlier that morning, one he prayed was the right step. A longtime friend and trusted attorney, someone who understood the shadows between corporate law and criminal deceit, now knew enough to start the wheels turning. Quietly, discreetly, they were opening a path toward federal eyes, not against Jonathan, but against Cain. Still, the cost mounted with every hour. News crews camped outside Coleman Hospitality headquarters. Social media painted him as a villain. Even his closest board members began to distance themselves. For a man who had spent his career building integrity, it felt like a public execution carried out in slow motion. Rachel stood with him in the alley, clutching the unsigned document. "He'll keep pushing," she said, her voice low. "He won't stop until one of us breaks." Jonathan's reply was steel wrapped in calm. "Then we don't break. Not now." For the first time since they'd joined forces, the battle no longer felt like a secret investigation. It was war. Open, dirty, and dangerous. Cain had struck hard, but Jonathan and Rachel still had pieces left to play. The trick would be surviving long enough to set the board in their favor. And as the neon lights of Times Square blinked overhead, the dangerous game entered its next move. The message arrived just before midnight. Rachel had been folding uniforms in the corner of her living room, while Lily slept on the couch, crayons still scattered around her small hands. Her phone buzzed, screen lighting the dim apartment with a picture that froze her blood. Lily walking home from school, her backpack crooked, colored pencils sticking out of the side pocket. Beneath it, 4 words. "She looks so small." Rachel's hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the phone. Fear, sharp and suffocating, tightened around her chest. She rushed to lock every window, checked the chain on the door twice, then stood by Lily, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, as if the rhythm itself might vanish. By morning, the fear hadn't lifted. It followed her on the subway, into the diner, through every shift. She met Jonathan in the alley, her voice breaking in a way she hadn't let him hear before. "They're watching her. I can't protect her alone." Jonathan didn't waste a second. He pulled out his phone, dialing a contact who owed him more than one favor. Within hours, 2 NYPD detectives arrived at Rachel's apartment, their presence quiet but firm. They installed a patrol rotation in the neighborhood, set up extra surveillance at Lily's school, and gave Rachel a direct number to call if she saw anything suspicious. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. For Rachel, even that small shield felt like a thin wall against a storm. The first night, she sat awake by the window with the lights off, her eyes darting at every car that slowed near the curb. Lily stirred once, mumbling in her sleep, and Rachel whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I've got you, baby. No one's going to take you from me." At the diner, Cain's presence grew heavier. He no longer bothered with subtlety. His cronies loitered near the counter, watching Rachel as if daring her to slip. Once she felt a hand brush her arm too deliberately as she passed with a tray. Another time she found her locker open, Lily's school photo pinned to the inside with a knife mark scratched across the corner. Every day was survival. Yet somehow, Jonathan's steady presence gave her courage. He met her in quiet corners, listened without judgment, and never once suggested giving up. His disguise as a customer remained intact, but his resolve deepened with every threat Cain hurled their way. One evening, as rain pounded against the diner's windows, Rachel slid into the booth across from him. She gripped his hand with desperate strength, her eyes glassy but fierce. "Don't let him win," she whispered. Jonathan's hand tightened around hers. For a moment, the disguise fell away. He wasn't just another customer, or even just the CEO. He was a man willing to stake everything on keeping her and Lily safe. "I promise," he said, "not while I still have breath." The storm outside rattled the glass, thunder echoing through the city. Inside, the diner buzzed with the uneasy energy of staff who knew too much and said too little. Rachel pulled back her hand reluctantly, but the vow hung between them, stronger than the threats pressing in from every side. Kane's shadow grew larger, but so too did the fragile alliance that dared to resist him. The walls of Jonathan Cole's world felt like they were closing in. Every news outlet carried his face now, framed by words like fraud and disgrace. Each broadcast chipped at his credibility, painting him as the kind of man who built an empire only to plunder it from within. And though he knew the truth, doubt seeped in like water through cracked stone. The forged evidence Kane had planted was ruthless in its precision. Transfers, signatures, email trails, fabricated so well that even Jonathan's closest allies in the company hesitated. In boardrooms, silence replaced loyalty. On social media, strangers who once praised him now spat his name like a curse. He retreated to the diner more often, the only place where his disguise still gave him anonymity. But even there, shadows pressed close. Victor Kane prowled like a predator who knew the hunt was nearly over, his confidence sharp enough to cut. Rachel was the only constant. She hadn't signed the papers accusing him, despite the pressure. She kept bringing him scraps of truth, copies, recordings, notes scribbled in haste, each one a fragile lifeline in the storm. But could he trust her completely? Late one night, Jonathan sat in his apartment, the city humming beyond the window. On the table before him lay two piles, Kane's damning evidence and Rachel's quiet offerings of loyalty. One told him to run, to protect himself by severing ties before he drowned in her fight. The other whispered of courage, of a single mother who had risked everything when she could have looked away. His chest ached with the weight of the choice. Logic warned him not to gamble his career, his reputation, on a waitress whose world looked nothing like his. But his heart, the same instinct that had made him slip into that diner in disguise, refused to abandon her. The next day, he returned to the diner, no longer content to sit in the shadows. Rachel met him in the alley behind the building, her hands gripping a folder of documents so tightly the edges bent. She looked at him with exhaustion carved into her face, yet her eyes held fire. "They're going to destroy you," she said. "You still have a way out. Distance yourself. Let me take the fall. At least your life won't be ruined." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I won't walk away. Not from you. Not from the truth. If Kane wants me ruined, then let him try. I'd rather lose everything than betray the one person who's had the courage to stand beside me." Rachel blinked, her lips parting, as if she wanted to argue. But no words came. For a moment, the rain-soaked alley fell silent, except for the distant rumble of traffic. She reached into the folder, pulling free a set of original invoices she'd hidden for weeks. "Then we fight together," she said. Jonathan took them, his decision sealed. This was the point of no return, not just for his career, but for the fragile bond between them. Trust was no longer optional. It was survival. Inside the diner, Victor Kane leaned against the counter, watching with the smirk of a man certain of his victory. He didn't yet know that Jonathan and Rachel had crossed the line into open defiance, but soon he would. For Jonathan, the paradox resolved itself in a single truth. Trust wasn't a weakness. It was the only weapon sharp enough to cut through Cain's lies. And as Rachel slipped back inside, leaving Jonathan with the damp folder pressed against his chest, he knew he had chosen his side completely. Her side. Whatever the cost. The day of the board meeting arrived cloaked in tension. Jonathan Cole walked through the revolving doors of Coleman Hospitality headquarters, not as a disgraced CEO begging for mercy, but as a man carrying the weight of evidence sharp enough to cut chains. His suit was pressed, his jaw set, but beneath the polished surface beat the steady thrum of risk. If today failed, everything, his company, Rachel, Lily, would collapse beneath Cain's grip. Inside the glass-walled conference room, the board sat stiff and wary, their eyes already clouded with suspicion. At the far end, Victor Cain adjusted his tie with theatrical confidence, his briefcase resting like a weapon on the table. He greeted Jonathan with a smile that reeked of victory. "Gentlemen," Victor began, his voice smooth, "we must address the grave misconduct that has jeopardized this company. I bring forth proof that Mr. Cole has funneled funds through shell suppliers, aided by one of our own employees, Miss Rachel Adams." He clicked the remote, and screens lit up with doctored spreadsheets, falsified transfers, Rachel's signature spliced onto documents she had never touched. Gasps rippled around the table. Jonathan sat still, watching the trap spring, letting the noose tighten. Then he leaned forward. "Impressive," he said evenly. "But there's one problem." Rachel entered at that moment, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. She carried a small recorder and a folder worn from weeks of hiding. Setting them on the table, she spoke for the first time before the board. "You forged my name, but I kept the originals." Jonathan pressed play. Victor's voice filled the room, captured in a recording Rachel had risked everything to secure. "Inflate the invoices, double the deliveries. If anyone talks, remind them their families live in this city too." The color drained from Victor's face, but Jonathan wasn't finished. He opened his folder, laying out real invoices beside the counterfeits, each marked with Rachel's meticulous notes. The differences screamed from the page. Inflated costs, phantom suppliers, duplicate charges. "This company has been bled from within," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Not by me, by him." At that precise moment, the conference doors burst open. 2 FBI agents, accompanied by NYPD officers, stepped inside. The lead agent flashed a badge. "Victor Cain, you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy." The room erupted. Chairs scraped, voices clashed, but the agents moved with calm efficiency. Victor tried to rise, sputtering denials, but the cuffs snapped around his wrists before he could finish his protest. His briefcase spilled across the floor, envelopes of cash, a ledger scribbled with codes, damning proof of his empire's rot. Board members whispered in disbelief, some turning pale as they realized how close they had come to siding with the wrong man. Jonathan remained seated, his calm unbroken, though relief surged through him like fire finally finding air. Rachel stood beside him, shoulders squared. For the first time, she didn't look like a waitress in taped shoes. She looked like the woman who had brought down a predator with nothing more than courage and stubborn truth. As Victor was led out, his eyes burned into theirs. "This isn't over," he hissed, but the echo of his voice sounded hollow against the clang of justice closing in. Jonathan glanced at Rachel, and a quiet understanding passed between them. The war wasn't fully won, but the decisive blow had landed. They had chosen trust, and trust had carried them through the fire. The board meeting ended not in disgrace but in transformation. The shadow network was broken, and for the first time the path ahead, though uncertain, belonged to them. The morning after Victor Kane's arrest, the sun rose over New York City with a clarity Rachel hadn't felt in years. For once, she didn't look over her shoulder walking Lily to school. The sidewalk smelled of rain and roasted coffee, ordinary and safe, and even that felt like a victory. News outlets shifted overnight. The same headlines that once accused Jonathan of fraud now blasted regional manager arrested in embezzlement ring. Pictures of Kane in handcuffs flooded the airwaves, his smirk replaced by disbelief. Jonathan's name, tarnished for weeks, began to shine again. Not as a man destroyed by scandal, but as a leader who had stared down corruption and refused to bow. At Coleman Hospitality headquarters, the board gathered once more. This time, Jonathan entered not as a man on trial, but as a CEO restored. He laid out reforms with the precision of someone who had walked through fire and learned what truly mattered: transparency in every ledger, independent audits of every contract, employee benefits that valued the people who carried the company on their backs. More radical still, he proposed employee stock ownership. This company belongs not to the few, he told them, but to everyone who turns on the lights, who serves the coffee, who keeps the doors open. We will rebuild not by fear, but by trust. The board, humbled, shaken, approved. For Rachel, life shifted in quiet but profound ways. The diner, once heavy with shadows, felt lighter. The dead camera domes were replaced with working ones. Paychecks came on time, tips flowed honestly, and shifts no longer carried the taste of dread. Jonathan called her into his office weeks later, offering a new role: training manager for the entire group. She blinked at the title, disbelief fighting with pride. "I'm just a waitress," she murmured. "No," Jonathan corrected gently. "You're the reason this company still stands. You've already trained us in courage. Now we need you to train in truth." Rachel accepted, tears she didn't expect pricking her eyes. The promotion meant more than a paycheck. It meant a future where Lily could see her mother not just surviving, but rising. Evenings at their small apartment grew warmer. Rachel pulled out her old accounting textbooks, determined to finish the degree she once had to abandon. Lily sat beside her at the table, coloring while her mother studied, both of them dreaming bigger than before. And slowly, between reports and reforms, something deeper blossomed between Rachel and Jonathan. What had begun as necessity, two people bound by danger, grew into something steadier. Trust became tenderness. Tenderness became love. Months later, in the soft glow of autumn, they stood together at the Central Park Zoo. Friends, colleagues, and employees gathered, not for a corporate announcement, but for a wedding. Rachel wore a simple ivory dress. Lily scattered flower petals with giggles brighter than bells. Jonathan looked at them both as if he had been waiting his whole life to find home. They exchanged vows beneath the open sky, promises forged not in comfort, but in fire. And when the ceremony ended, it wasn't the applause or the photographs that mattered most. It was Lily, tugging Jonathan's hand and calling him Dad for the first time. The city moved on around them, but for Rachel, Jonathan, and Lily, a new dawn had truly begun. The months that followed carried a different rhythm. Coleman Hospitality began to hum with a spirit it had long forgotten. One not driven by fear or greed, but by people who believed they mattered. Cafeterias filled with laughter again. Pay stubs carried dignity instead of dread. And in quiet corners of offices and kitchens, workers whispered Rachel's name with respect. The waitress who had faced down a giant and lived to change the story. For Jonathan, the trial by fire had left scars, but also clarity. He had once thought leadership meant holding the highest seat at the table, but the truth was simpler. Leadership meant listening to the lowest voice in the room, the one most often silenced. It meant standing beside those who risked everything to do what was right. Rachel, too, carried her own transformation. She was no longer the woman taping her shoes together between shifts. As training manager, she traveled across branches, teaching not just systems but courage, reminding employees that integrity wasn't optional, it was survival. At night, she studied with steady determination, one semester closer to finishing the degree she once abandoned. Lily thrived in the new light. The girl who once clutched her backpack tightly on shadowed streets now skipped into school with colored pencils peeking out of her bag, secure in the knowledge that her mother and Jonathan stood guard over her world. Looking back, Rachel often asked herself, how had a single napkin note changed everything? A few hurried words scribbled in fear had sparked an alliance, uncovered corruption, and built a family. Courage, she realized, didn't come in grand gestures. It came in small, trembling acts of honesty that refused to be silenced. Jonathan put it best one evening as they walked hand in hand through Central Park, leaves crunching underfoot, Lily racing ahead with a laugh that carried across the pond. Justice can be delayed, he said softly, but it cannot be silenced. Rachel smiled at him, her heart warmed by the truth in his words. Their story was not just about corruption or scandal. It was about the strength found in unexpected places, about love growing in the cracks of hardship, about loyalty that outlasted fear. And so the lessons lingered. One brave voice can change an entire system. Trust and loyalty, beyond power and profit, are the real sources of strength. Even when darkness presses hardest, courage has a way of finding its light. As their story came to rest in the hearts of those who heard it, Jonathan and Rachel hoped it carried more than entertainment. They hoped it sparked reflection. Because in the end, it wasn't about a CEO or a waitress. It was about ordinary people deciding to stand up when silence would have been safer. And perhaps for those listening, it was an invitation. When injustice comes knocking at your own door, will you be brave enough to open it with truth? If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe power or honesty is stronger? And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, I'd be grateful if you hit like and subscribe, so we can keep sharing this journey together.